everyone, and welcome to another episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Allie Roden, and I'm the digital media producer here at Seed World Group. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to be your host. Last week on Seed Speaks, you heard two specialists discuss the Red Barn myth. This week, we're addressing the myths surrounding gene editing and how those misconceptions can impact regulatory decisions and future technology. To help us learn more, we've got two fantastic panelists joining us. Jon Entine, Executive Director of the Genetic Literacy Project, and Sarah Davidson, Lead of Stakeholder Communication at Pairwise. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. So let's start with some introductions. Jon, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your role?
Sure, thank you. Thrilled to be on the show, Allie. I'm a lifelong journalist. Spent 20 years in network television in New York with ABC and NBC, and actually did a documentary on population genetics issues while I was there, and it led to a focus on biotechnology and genetics. Written a number of books in this area, a lot on crop biotechnology and also on pesticides and chemicals. I'm very focused on sustainable agriculture, how new innovation can really increase that. And in 2011, I launched the Genetic Literacy Project, now in its 11th year, that focuses on biomedical issues, but also heavily on sustainable agriculture, gene editing, genetic modification of one kind or another. So we act to be a resource for journalists, for policy people. We interact with the public, and our goal is constructive engagement on these issues. And we try to really steer clear of pure ideological issues and focus on what the technology can do and what are its potential drawbacks.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jon. And Sarah, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your role at Pairwise?
Great. Thanks, Allie. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak about one of my favorite topics, which is the role that gene editing and technology can play in helping us improve our food systems. So I'm a plant scientist by training, spent a number of years at Cornell University communicating about the science of agriculture and technologies like gene editing and other biotechnologies. And today, I'm pleased to be at Pairwise as our lead for stakeholder communication. And at Pairwise, we are looking forward to being among the first, if not the first, to launch a gene-edited product into the produce aisles of US supermarkets in 2023. So great to be here.
Thank you. That's so exciting. So let's go ahead and dive right into some questions. This first one, I'm just going to open the floor. So whoever wants to take a stab at it first, go for it. So let's start off with a bit of background information. What are the main differences between gene-edited and genetically modified crops?
Yeah, I can take this one. So the way I like to think about it in sort of a simple form is that most of the genetically modified crops that have been produced to date involve taking a piece of DNA from one species and moving it into another. So you can think about taking a DNA sequence from a bacterium, for example, and moving it into a plant. And of course, DNA is DNA no matter what species it comes from, but there is that sort of sense of gene transfer. Most gene-edited crops or applications of gene editing, in contrast, don't involve moving DNA from one species to another. Rather, you're just going into an organism's genome and making a very subtle, smart, and informed change in its own genome. So this really isn't that different than what could happen in nature if you gave it a long time, or what happens in conventional breeding. It's just done in a much more directed and informed way. And of course, because of these differences, the regulatory environment is also very different. So in many countries, these subtle changes that are brought about by gene editing, because they're no different than what could happen in conventional breeding, gene edited crops are treated as conventional.
I wanted to underscore a couple of things you said. I think it's key to understand that the opposition to genetic modification had been around the concept of foreign genes, and that's the terms like Franken genes or Franken foods originates with the idea of moving a gene from one species to another. As Sarah mentioned, that happens in nature all the time. And frankly, DNA is DNA. One of the reasons we have stem cells that can differentiate into all kinds of organs is because of the ability for DNA to take on different forms. So I think it's been an overstatement about a concern focusing on genetic modifications, but it has been the centerpiece of the criticism of GMOs by activist groups. Interestingly, as we've now moved into the era of gene editing, what was the centerpiece of their criticism has now been completely dropped because they don't have that target anymore. And now they're focusing on unintended consequences and other issues that have some degree of merit, as we can discuss, but much less so. And the other point I wanted to make is that we shouldn't see these two technologies in isolation. Many of the innovations that are going to be coming in the agricultural sphere will involve a combination of genetic modification and gene editing. There will be some that will be just focused on gene editing, and that's great, but a lot will require, for the best solutions, to utilize both technologies. So it's important that we don't throw GMOs and the idea of transgenic foreign genes under the bus in this discussion.
Great points from both of you. Thank you. So I know, Sarah, you touched on this a little bit in your last response, but maybe you can kick off this question. What are the current regulations surrounding gene editing in the US right now?
Yeah, well, I think that's a work that's in progress. I know that at Pairwise, we have gone through the MI regulated process, and it's been deemed that our product that we'll launch on the market is no different than what could be achieved through conventional means, and is therefore not a GM. But Jon, I'll turn it over to you to speak more about regulatory issues.
Yeah, one thing I do want to underscore is that if you go to the geneticliteracyproject.org website, we have on our front page on the upper left a gene editing regulation tracker, which focuses not only on crop biotechnology, also on biomedical innovation, and also on gene drives, many of which employ gene editing techniques. And it really has a country by country, region by region breakdown of what the regulatory status is around the world, and then kind of makes some assessments of what the prospects are for innovation in those areas with the regulatory structures now in place. It also highlights which NGOs are anti-gene editing and how they've modified their arguments from their old inherited anti-GMO platforms. So as Sarah has mentioned, we have a regulatory system in place in the United States, Canada, and a few other places. Japan is another example where most gene editing products are being scrutinized but treated as if they are not similar to transgenics. Because the gene changes that can occur are similar to what you see in nature, and we are focusing on product and not process. In other words, what the product is rather than how you got there. They are being regulated at a pretty low level, even though there's only been a handful, about 5 or 6 gene-edited crops that have been approved so far in the U.S. But over time, that will increase dramatically. In other countries, there's various stages of regulations. I think the backwater, and that's my characterization, is Europe, where they have essentially are seeming like they're going to regulate gene editing similar to the way they regulated GMOs, again, as a process rather than as a product. There's a lot of opposition by individual countries to the overall EU stance. And frankly, the combination of the war in Ukraine, disruptive war in Ukraine, challenging food supplies around the world, and also famines in Africa and elsewhere have dramatically changed both the public debate and also the regulatory debate over the role that gene editing could play in producing sustainable agriculture. So it's very much in flux, changes literally daily. I do suggest you do take a look at that gene editing regulatory tracker. We try to keep up with what the latest news is around the world on those issues.
Awesome, thank you. And I know, Jon, you just referenced this, that there are 5 or 6 approved gene edited foods. Are those available in the US, or can you kind of explain that a bit further?
Sure. The crops that are available, there's gene edited versions of soybean, canola, rice, mushrooms, camelina, which is a false flax for enhanced omega-3 oil, and a waxy corn. They're in different stages of distribute at this point, but they're not what you'd call home run crops at this point. There's a lot of climate change focused crops dealing with obviously resilience issues that we're facing all around the world that could really be game changers in a sizable way. I think these are nibbling at the potential markets, but there are huge opportunities ongoing. Some countries, Britain has broken away from the EU's regulatory structure and has been introducing, I think there's a tomato, if I'm not mistaken, coming out there's been a tomato genetically gene edited tomato in Japan as well. So there are little breakthroughs, but the huge wave, I think, is coming, and a lot will depend on how Europe handles its current debate over how to go forward with gene editing.
Yeah, maybe I'll share that I am really excited about the tomato that Jon referenced that's been commercialized in Japan. This is what we call a high GABA tomato. It has health benefits. So this is a tomato that's been developed by Sanatech Seeds. And I think they had a really interesting go-to-market strategy where they essentially made the seeds available to home gardeners and let them grow their own gene-edited tomatoes. That the GABA is an amino acid that's naturally occurring that is often consumed as a supplement by Japanese folks. It has health benefits, lowering high blood pressure, et cetera. And so there's this new era of really bringing traits that have direct benefits to consumers. And I think this is in part why consumers are so excited about the role that gene editing can play in improving the food system.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up, that consumers do seem to be excited. So in that realm, what role does food marketing play, and how can that increase the likelihood of consumers to accept gene-edited crops going forward?
I would just say that, as Sarah had mentioned, we are now developing crops that and foods as a result of the crops and seed changes that actually have tangible benefits in people's lives. The first generation of GMOs were extremely important. They have had huge impact in lowering pesticide use, for instance, but particularly with insect resistant with crops, and lowering the toxicity with herbicide resistant crops. But they were benefits felt by the farmers down the supply chain and into consumer world. Definitely there were benefits keeping down prices and so forth, but they weren't really easily tangible and promotable. But the new generation of ones are all solving health problems, addressing climate change issues, things that people I think can really relate to, and that changes the public relations around this issue. And I don't want to reduce this to a public relations effort, but when you're producing products that everyday people can appreciate, the enthusiasm is going to grow. I think there's still a lot of people have never heard of the word CRISPR, never heard of the word gene editing. We live in a world where all of us talk about this every day. So I think that the educational opportunities to push these products out and expose people to the potential benefits are really huge, but not without some challenges because of anti-biotechnology opposition that's very widespread and in some cases growing.
Yeah, maybe I'll build on that to say that, I think, it's pretty clear that CRISPR and gene editing is going to play a really important role in delivering healthy, nutritious food in a sustainable way. And what we know about today's consumers is that they want to make food choices that align with their values, values around personal nutrition, values around, trying to improve environmental sustainability. And so I think it's really important to share these stories with consumers on how gene editing can help achieve these goals. We know, as Jon said, that very few consumers know much about gene editing. But when they learn about it, they feel really positive about it. And they're especially excited about the role that gene editing can play in helping us both produce more nutritious food, as well as food that's grown with fewer pesticides or using fewer natural resources like water. So I think consumers are excited about solving these big challenges while at the same time having a safe, healthy, and nutritious food supply.
Awesome. Thank you both. So I'm going to open the floor to kind of share some misconceptions that you both have personally heard about gene edited foods that are brought on by the misunderstanding between gene editing and gene modification, and all of those myths that are spreading about both. And how would you address those claims?
I'll start by just saying that I think, probably the biggest confusion is really around the language. I think people have heard the term CRISPR and they're excited about CRISPR. Gene editing is a little bit harder of a concept to understand. And I think that because gene editing sounds a lot like genetic engineering, it's hard for people to sort of understand what the differences are. So I think, it just points to how important it is to use the right language.
I want to underscore when the first generation of GMO crops came out in the 90s and early 2000s, they were all developed by large corporations I think there's been some studies that it was $120 million to bring any specific GMO crop to commercialization, which meant the barrier to entry was huge, and only a large corporation, a Bayer, a Monsanto, a DuPont, can afford the time, the investment, the money, and the regulatory hassles, navigating the regulatory hassles to do that. Gene editing, although it's not without its research challenges, is a much more streamlined process. And you have examples where, for instance, Penn State University for under $50,000 developed a mushroom, a gene-edited mushroom that's now available, and it opens up an opportunity to change the public dynamic about this. There's still an anti-corporate, even an anti-capitalist, I would say, tendency among critics to evoke these kinds of fears, takeover of the food supply by Monsanto, for instance. I mean, they're not without some concerns that are legitimate, that large corporations have played an oversized role. That's not necessarily going to happen with gene editing. A lot of universities, a lot of startup companies are innovating in this field. The barrier to entry financially is much lower. And I think it's important to convey that reality to people that, hey, this is real innovation. It really fits the American model of innovation. And as critics are doing, raising the specter of a takeover by big corporations of the gene editing revolution is really not accurate. And it's important that these issues be framed in a way that's consumer friendly and actually factually accurate.
Yeah, and maybe I'll share. I think people are really excited about gene editing when they learn about it. We're not seeing a lot of resistance to the technology at all. If we look at some data that the Alliance for Science, based at the Boyce Thompson Institute for Plant Research, put out recently, they've been sort of tracking sentiment around gene editing as presented in both traditional media and social media over the years. And, if you look from 2018 to today, the conversation is extraordinarily favorable. In 2020, it peaks at like over 90% favorable. And so people, that both on social media where, everyone can engage in the conversation, as well as in, more reputable, top tier English language traditional media, the conversation is very favorable. And we see this peak in 2020. And I think it's because many people think that it's because people really appreciated the role that biotechnology, even though it was medical biotechnology, played in helping develop our life-saving vaccines during the COVID pandemic. And that had a halo effect even on agricultural applications. And still today, we see a very, very favorable conversation. And indeed, the conversation in 2021 becomes even more favorable on social media than traditional media. So it's people are talking about it, they're excited about it. And that really tracks with the experience that we're seeing on the street with our first product that we'll be bringing out in 2023, a nutrient-dense salad green. So we went and met people sort of where they are on the streets in large cities like Seattle and in the Bay Area and Austin, Texas, offered them, a taste of a delicious salad that's, nutrient rich and flavorful and colorful. And, people are excited about the product. They're excited about having a new offering in the produce aisle. And they're not bothered by the technology. In fact, many people are excited about the fact that their food's been developed with an innovative technology. So it's a different generation, a different era. People are excited about the role that technology can play in helping us produce exciting new foods.
Amazing. Those are awesome points, guys. So I have one final question before we wrap up our chat. So what efforts are being made to help the public identify the facts from the myths when addressing gene-edited foods?
I think this is a complicated question for a number of different reasons. There are a number of groups out there, well-meaning, I think. I would call them middle of the road in terms of whether they support genetic innovation in food versus seeing the specter of potential problems that are attempting to set up regulatory frameworks separate from what exists right now. In other words, actually modify them a little bit. Their claim is that they're hoping to avoid the rejectionism that accompanied the first wave of GMO innovation back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And they're pushing for certain kinds of regulatory barriers that don't now exist on gene editing. And again, they present themselves, and I think that they honestly believe this, that they are helping to build consumer confidence, so there isn't a backlash as happened before. I think they're misguided. I think that if we adopt labeling standards for gene editing, when, as Sarah has made it clear, it's really what happens in nature all the time. There's no real difference, and no test could distinguish between gene editing that occurred in a laboratory versus gene editing that occurred in nature. And by doing this, I think it opens up the opportunity by having these kinds of regulations. It would open up the opportunity for anti-GMO and anti-gene editing groups to find new avenues to try to undermine public confidence in this. I think that to assume that the anti-groups are good actors and looking to positively and constructively bring this technology to fruition is very, very naive. And I think these groups, again, well-meaning, are very naive themselves. And I think that's really important that we not adopt a regulatory structure that somehow distinguishes products based on their process. We really have to focus on, is the product in any way different from what's produced in nature? It's not with gene editing, and therefore we should not set higher barriers to entry into the marketplace. So that's a real warning sign, a red light that we have to be worried about, because these groups, again, portray themselves as well-intentioned.
Maybe I'll take a slightly different tact here. I mean, I as I said before, consumers, for the most part, they don't know a whole lot about gene editing and CRISPR, but they're curious about it. And when they learn about it, they feel very positive. So I think it's on all of us to get good information, good science-based information out there. I'm really pleased that, at Pairwise, we're very committed to transparency and helping people understand about the technology that's used to produce their food, whether it's gene editing or anything else. We want to help consumers make informed choices about what they eat or what they feed their families. So, for example, on our Conscious Foods website, you can go to the Conscious Foods website and you can hear about the technology that's used to develop our conscious greens. There's a gene editing 101s section where you can really dive a little bit deeper and learn about gene editing. And we want to make sure that, consumers, when they interact with our products in the supermarket, can quickly access that kind of information. So, journalists are going to play a really important role in helping people understand the role that CRISPR and gene editing can play. events like this that you're hosting here at Seed World are really important. So it's on all of us to get good science-based information out there to consumers so that they can make informed choices.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today, everyone. Thank you so much, Jon and Sarah, for joining us. And I hope our audience took home some fun knowledge today because I know that I learned a lot. If you liked this topic, make sure to tune in next week where my colleague Ashley Robinson is talking about the misconceptions of chemical use on crops. See you all then.